Hi, everyone. My name is Casey Wofford, and I am the confidential advocate with the Relationship Violence and Sexual Assault Prevention Program. My pronouns are she, hers. Thanks so much for joining me today. January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And so today, in honor of that and kind of wrapping up January, I'm going to be doing this presentation to just acknowledge the scope of human trafficking. It is so prevalent. It's everywhere. It's in our neighborhoods, it's in our backyards, it's in our cities. And so it's just so important to be aware of that and really raise that awareness. And really, human trafficking is just the very polite way of saying modern day slavery. So it's important to acknowledge that, yes, it's 2021 and slavery still exists. And if you have attended any of my other presentations by chance, you will know that sexual violence is deeply rooted in the history of the United States. It is deeply rooted within slavery and colonization. So when we talk about human trafficking, it's important to acknowledge that that ties right in line with sexual violence, especially sex trafficking. So we will be talking about human trafficking today, breaking it down into what it actually looks like, and how we can work to really address the problem. And I had found just this Instagram post really just if human trafficking were a company, it would be at the top of the Fortune 500 list. And if you look at different research, you will see that human trafficking is absolutely a multi-billion-dollar profiting illegal industry. It is slavery, but it still makes so much revenue for traffickers. And so it is a largely hidden crime. It goes unnoticed all the time. And so it's just important that we take today and our time together to acknowledge that it does exist. So today's objectives, of course, with it being the beginning of a new semester, I really quickly want to go over our VSP services, make sure that you are aware of those and how we can support you. That way, if this presentation brings up anything for you, if you start to question some things, wonder, was that a red flag, or I'm just curious, I'm worried about my friend, then you can definitely reach out to me. That's why I'm here to support you. Then we are going to define human trafficking and talk more about the scope of the problem. I will be breaking down different types of human trafficking. Definitely want to acknowledge that sex trafficking is absolutely not the same as sex work. And then talk about, okay, human trafficking is such a huge problem, but why? How do people get targeted into human trafficking? How do people become victims of human trafficking to perpetuate this global epidemic? And so we'll be talking about that. And then finally, of course, I always like to end on a hopeful note and talk about what you can do to contribute towards shifting towards a culture where modern day slavery is unacceptable, not tolerated. And while I know that that will take generations to come to truly end it, because human trafficking does do such a great job at adapting, and traffickers are really great at adapting to where their crimes do stay hidden, and know that I believe it's possible. And so I'm just thankful for y'all to take the time to learn about it. And then of course, I'm going to share with y'all the resources that I looked into for today's presentation and give y'all those resources so you can continue and further your education after this presentation. So our VSP relies on three main pillars. So we have education, support, and advocacy. So for education, that looks like exactly what I'm doing today. We do Facebook Lives. Our peer educators are amazing and our interns are amazing. Our graduate assistant, just shout out to all of them who do such a great job with raising awareness through our Instagram page and creating awesome posts. We also have coffee and conversations, which is something we're going to be starting up next week with our peer educators, talking about different topics and current events every week to raise awareness about what sexual violence and relational violence can look like. And then with support can really look different for anyone. So if anybody reaches out to our office, they can reach out and talk to me. They can call, they can send us an email, they can just walk into our office in Ransom Hall 301. We are here Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. Our office is open, so we are available both virtually and in person, whatever you need to feel more comfortable. In terms of support, again, I'm a confidential advocate, which means if someone comes into my office to explore what their options are, if they want to report, then they can do that without having to make any decisions or having to move forward with a reporting process. So someone can come in, learn about all of their rights, all of their options, and then it is absolutely their responsibility to determine what is their best path to healing. I am here to make sure that they can make the most informed decision that's going to be the most helpful for themselves. For support, we have access to emergency housing. We can help with academic accommodations. We can also help get someone connected if they need to go get STI screening or just go in for a forensic exam after assault. And so support can look a lot of different ways. Linkage to mental health resources, even basic needs if someone's being kicked out of their home and so they need to get food resources. We can talk about that. So support looks really different for everybody, but we absolutely provide that. So if you ever have any questions about that, please don't hesitate to reach out. And then finally, advocacy. So advocacy to me means essentially that I am here to support a survivor, victim, however they choose to identify, not only when they are sitting in front of me, but really towards creating that culture that is not going to tolerate sexual or relationship violence. And in order to end sexual violence, we have to end all forms of violence. So advocacy also looks like not only working to end sexism, to end sexual violence, but then really looking at it from an anti-oppression framework and saying we have to end all forms of oppression, which can sound so overwhelming, but it is definitely something that we have to do if we want to advocate for a better culture for survivors and victims to live in and a better culture that won't produce perpetrators. So now that we've talked about our VSP services, I really want to dive into spending the rest of our time together focusing on human trafficking. And so human trafficking, which is also known as modern day slavery, is a crime that involves compelling or coercing a person to provide labor or services or to engage in commercial sex acts. The coercion can be subtle or overt, physical or psychological. And if you look up the definition for human trafficking, you will find different definitions on different websites, but this is the definition from the Department of Justice. And what I liked about this definition is that it really highlighted that it can be subtle or overt, physical or psychological. So when we talk about human trafficking, you can see someone who walks outside during the day, sun shining on their face, just looks like their life is completely together, everything's okay, but really they can feel 100% trapped. They could be in significant debt and feel like they have to continue to perform commercial sex acts for their trafficker in order to pay them back for love and affection that they've shown them. It can just be so hidden in plain sight. And so I thought that the fact that this really highlighted that human trafficking can be subtle or overt was really important. But at the end of the day, human trafficking will always involve coercion of some sort or fraud or force. And so don't think that human trafficking looks like someone needing to be bruised in order for us to see it, right? It just, again, it can be right under your nose and you have no idea, which can be really a scary feeling. But it's important that we acknowledge that that is a reality. It is important to be able to distinguish human trafficking from human smuggling. So human trafficking, I think sometimes we hear that word traffic and we think, like going somewhere, transportation, someone crossing borders, and that is not what it is either. Human trafficking does not require someone to be removed from their home or cross state borders or even international borders. Human trafficking can occur right where someone has grown up, within their neighborhood, within their school district. And so it is not the same as smuggling, and that I just want to distinguish that. So the scope of the problem. So I got this infographic from the Blue Campaign, which is with the US Homeland Security Department. And really, when we look at the scope of the problem, the biggest things that I want to highlight here is that millions of people are trafficked each year. And I know I've spoken to the fact that it is such an underreported and hidden crime. So it really is impossible to determine the full extent of this problem, but it is millions each year. And those millions of people, it's not specific to women. It can be anyone of any gender identity, any ethnicity, any race, any sexual orientation. So human trafficking does not know any bounds, right? It doesn't discriminate by some kind of identity. It can impact anyone. We do know that it's going to impact vulnerable populations, marginalized populations more fully, and we'll talk more about that later. But regardless, it's a problem that impacts millions of people who are trafficked each year. And if you look at different research, I saw things ranging from that it profits $99 billion a year towards this 150 number. But regardless, it is a multi-billion-dollar profiting illegal industry each year. And so that is an extremely high number. And again, if we think about different businesses, that's so much higher than so many businesses accumulated. And so it's no wonder that it's not stopping because it's so profitable from traffickers. I know I've heard people say, oh, if like traffickers would just use their skills and mind for good, then it could be done. And it's like, well, if traffickers are making billions of dollars and never being held accountable or experiencing any of consequences, what is motivation to then quit that and then change to a position where they're not making anything? So again, we have to work on changing our culture from a multi-pronged approach in order to stop this problem. And we'll talk about the different types of trafficking. I thought it was important that this infographic really highlighted when you're thinking about the scope of the problem, thinking about the fact that it impacts vulnerable populations. One of those populations is definitely children, especially middle school age children between the ages of 11 and 16. And when you think about that age, even more exponentially, it impacts foster children or runaways. And I've seen statistics and facts that say when someone runs away from their home, it's usually within 48 hours that a trafficker can approach them and start to try to build a relationship with them to eventually manipulate them and maintain control over them. So the big main two types of human trafficking are sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Sex trafficking is, again, they both fall on that force, fraud, or coercion piece, but sex trafficking is in using that power to induce another individual to sell sex and engage in commercial sex acts. And labor trafficking is using that power to induce another individual to work or provide a service. These are both examples of modern day slavery, and they both are prevalent all around the world, not just in one place. If you look at these two types of trafficking, sex trafficking, the way that it actually presents itself, different common types of sex trafficking would be e-services, pornography, illicit massage businesses, brothels, and outdoor solicitation. Common types of labor trafficking would be agricultural, domestic work, restaurants, cleaning services, and even, I think one that we forget about sometimes, but carnivals can be an example of labor trafficking. And I want to acknowledge that these are the two main big groups, but if you look at different research, different websites, you'll also see other types of trafficking being acknowledged. So one of those would be forced marriage, otherwise known as child marriage. And that's a marriage that takes place without the consent of one or both people in the marriage. Like sometimes family members will threaten to use force to make someone consent to marriage. And if you are making someone consent to marriage, that in itself is not consent. An example of what this could look like would be maybe you have a parent who is hooked on some kind of substance. I know opioids are a huge problem in the US. So if someone is hooked on opioids but doesn't have the finances to be able to continue their use, then maybe they're looking to a trafficker to provide that monetary supply. And so they say, I will have my daughter or my son marry you in order for me to continue to get money for my opioids. That could be an example of what that looks like. And again, it's important to even realize with forced marriage, it's not just women who are victims, men are victims. It could be anyone of any gender identity. And it wasn't actually until there's different laws in different states, but I think something that's interesting to think of is it wasn't until 2018 that child marriage became illegal in the state of Delaware. And that was the first state to actually ban child marriage and say that children need to be at the age of 18 before getting married. So for most states, someone can be younger than that and their parent can consent to them, or a judge can say it's okay. They have to get a parent approval. But Delaware was the first one to say even with parent approval, it has to be 18 that someone can be married. Another form of trafficking is child soldiers. So with child soldiers, the way that presents itself is that people will be abducted, or boys will be abducted, women will be abducted, and then used to basically engage in violence. Threats can be made against them. If you don't join our gang, if you don't join our side, then something bad is going to happen to you. So they're put in an impossible position or in between a rock and a hard place, or they're going to starve to death if they don't become a soldier. It can also look like someone being taken from their home and then being used as a tool of war. So even someone being taken from their home and then a bomb is strapped on them and then they're used literally as a weapon for the gain of someone else's position on something. And so that is still very common at different places around the world. Debt bondage, what that looks like is, let's say that my parents came to America because they wanted a better life for me. So someone offered to pay for their ticket over if they then worked for their business, and they offered to give them room and assistance as long as they agreed that they would work for that family. And then they get to the United States and all of a sudden it becomes, okay, there's no way that any of this is documented. There's no way that I even know, my parents even know what the loan is, so they don't know how to pay it back. They're not making any additional money, so they never have the ability to then get that financial independence. And so it's just a lifelong servitude. And then my parents unfortunately pass away at an old age, and I'm still living there. And so that same person that was in charge of my parents and was the trafficker of my parents is now my direct trafficker, saying, okay, your parents never paid off their debt, so now you have to pay off their debt. And that is what debt bondage looks like, is it can just last from generation to generation of the trafficker having control. And the traffickers can be generational as well. And then finally, another form of trafficking that I wanted to highlight was organ trafficking. I don't feel like it's talked about a lot, but organ trafficking just is terrible. I mean, all forms of human trafficking are absolutely terrible, but organ trafficking definitely preys on desperate situations of both recipients and donors. And essentially it just creates an avenue for international organ trafficking to occur. And what traffickers will do in those scenarios is they will just exploit the desperation of donors to improve their economic situation, and they will exploit the desperation of recipients who have few options of ways to prolong their life. And so you will have organ traffickers who are just profiting off of that desperation. And research has shown that with organ trafficking too, that can be people in very recognized and highly reputable and respected professions. It has included doctors, healthcare professionals, and so it's just kind of wild to think about. And the most common organ found in trafficking is the liver. Just a fun fact that I wanted to throw in there. So there are tons of different types of trafficking. Again, the two biggest groups that I wanted to point out are labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And then moving forward, we're really going to focus on sex trafficking just because we are the Relationship Violence and Sexual Assault Prevention Program. And so something that I want to clear up right away is that sex trafficking and sex work are not the same. So sex work is voluntary. It's mutually consenting adults that are agreeing to a sexual transaction, and they're of legal age. Trafficking forces victims into dependency on the traffickers. And especially if anyone is under the age of 18 and engaging in a commercial sex act, that is automatically, hands down, illegal, no questions about it. And so that's really something that's important to know. But unfortunately, many people continue to think that sex work and sex trafficking are the same thing. And I will acknowledge that when you think about pornography, which I said is a common type of sex trafficking earlier, it's hard, like you can't really separate the two out, and it can be really hard to identify when it's truly a consensual sexual transaction between two mutually agreeing adults or however many, or if it's sex trafficking. So one thing that happens a lot with sex trafficking is that the trafficker will manipulate or coerce someone into engaging in a commercial sex act, and then they will record it at the same time, and then they will find a third party that will post that video. And then when that third party is posting that video, they will have, tons and tons of viewers, however many 100,000. I know even with COVID, we have seen the rise in people watching pornography, especially with isolation that's occurring, or people just weren't seeing their partners, or so a lot of people were engaging in more pornography usage. And it's, again, important to realize, okay, do you know more about that third party that you're watching it from? Are you paying to watch it? If someone is not paying or buying the services of sex workers, buying their goods or products, if they are buying from a third party, it's really important to look more into that and make sure the sex workers are being compensated fairly and treated with dignity and respect, and are consenting and fully conscious and aware that they're engaging in sex work. So it's really just important to distinguish these two things. And unfortunately, with sex trafficking and sex work and people not being able to really tease the two out from each other, especially with our policymakers and lawmakers, we have so many groups that advocate for us to end human trafficking, sex trafficking, which is so important. And I absolutely agree with, I think everyone would agree that we need to end sex trafficking. No child should be sold for sex. No human should be sold for sex. We can all get on that same page. But then when it's hard to distinguish from a third party, like what is sex trafficking, what is sex work, if people aren't aware of how just rampant this problem is, then policymakers and lawmakers will start to make laws that deter traffickers from having people sex trafficking. And then inadvertently, that actually can harm sex workers because it gives sex workers less rights or less ability to even screen potential clients. So one example of this, like Craigslist back pages, it was closed down, and that was supposed to be helping with ending sex trafficking. But a result from that, again, is that there's less screening for potential clients, there's less safe environments to operate in. And so it's just really important to realize that when we are making laws that are meant to end sex trafficking, that we are not also making laws that are giving sex workers less rights or criminalizing sex work. Because at the end of the day, sex work is as valid as any other form of labor. And I pulled this from, I liked these graphics, so I wanted to grab them and share them. It's the Instagram's right there. I would absolutely follow this Instagram. It had some really other great sex positive messages as well. So now, okay, we know sex trafficking, sex work, not the same thing, but we know human trafficking in general is a global epidemic. So why is it a global pandemic? Well, unfortunately, there are vulnerable populations, and really, when again, this all really connects back to forms of oppression and who is marginalized, not only in America but globally. And so when we think about the sexual violence continuum and the fact that that is rooted in oppression and different forms of oppression, we can still think about that as, okay, any group that is experiencing forms of oppression is gonna have trauma, and that can be um, an individual traumatic event, or it can be chronic trauma that just is occurring over and over again. If a group is experiencing tons of, like, I say a group, if someone with a certain identity is experiencing tons of microaggressions, those all add up, and they can give someone extremely low self-esteem, just emotional distress. And if someone's family doesn't accept them for who they are and their authentic selves, then they can want to run away from home to escape the feeling of being a burden on their family, or to start a life where they feel more loved in another area. So all of these factors really come together to make certain populations vulnerable. And when you think about it, yes, sex trafficking can impact anyone of any identity, but the highly vulnerable people are going to be the homeless population, runaway youth, LGBTQ plus individuals, and children in foster care. Because a lot of times with traffickers, again, they're smart. They are going to target certain populations who they know that they can manipulate. They know that they can get their buy-in, and they know that they can maintain control over them because they're not getting in a need filled somewhere else. And a lot of times when we are born, just in general, we think of family units as the child really creating a really strong attachment with their parental figures. But if that is not there for someone at a very young age, then it's not uncommon for them to then start to grow up and really seek that strong attachment figure, whether that is in the form of another intimate partner, or in the form of having like a role model or a mentor that they feel like loves them unconditionally, that they can trust. And what traffickers will do is they will be that attachment figure for somebody. And so they will show them love, they will gain their trust, and then after they've done that, they will flip the script and begin to abuse that person. But initially, it looks a lot to the victim or survivor, however they choose to identify, as a loving relationship. And so it's very, very manipulative, but it's a hard generational pattern to break. So if there's a generation that's living in poverty, if there's a generation that the parents are suffering from substance abuse, so they can't take care of a child, something like that, intergenerational trauma can lead a lot to producing victims of human trafficking because of their innate vulnerability from a young age. And traffickers are really smart to also focus on targeting like middle schoolers, because if you think about that age, our brains are not fully developed. Our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that is responsible for making those like highly executive functioning decisions and like really thinking things through as like this has a consequence, is not developed. And so at that age, we're just a lot more susceptible to when someone shows us affection, then it just feels so good. And so it's a lot harder to think more holistically about, okay, this person's showing me affection, but why? What could be their motivation? Instead, it's just, I'm getting affection. I've never received it before. I'm so happy. And that's it. And so that's how a lot of this abuse starts. And I will say that I used to work for a mobile crisis counseling program business, and I actually would go out to a lot of different foster care homes because I was doing suicide risk assessments. And something that I did notice is that there would be like foster parents that were fully aware that there were traffickers nearby. And so if a foster kid ran away from their home, they were aware like a trafficker is absolutely waiting to prey on them. And so traffickers become very familiar with like where children in foster care are with the system, so that again they can target these really vulnerable youth. And so I kind of mentioned, you know, that a trafficker can really take on this role of this attachment figure in someone's life. And so I talked about how it starts off to the victim looking like a loving relationship, like, oh, like finally someone who understands me and accepts me for who I am. When really what this is it's part of a predator's grooming process. And what grooming is it's a prep process for when a predator just gradually gains a person's trust, but their intention the entire time is to exploit them. And the stages of grooming first are targeting a victim, so identifying this person seems like they're emotionally distressed. This can happen a lot on chat rooms or on the internet through different apps. So if someone like a kid is just on an app saying, oh, I hate my parents, they suck, they never treat me well, like a predator can reach out to them or be someone among many in a chat room that says, oh, you deserve better. And they can just start to then take that person out of the chat room, have their own individual conversations, and really start to gain that person's trust, validate that person's experiences, and say, I'll love you, I'll fulfill that need. And so targeting a victim is really finding which people, more likely at a younger age, although it absolutely happens and can happen at any age, are more emotionally vulnerable or have a low self-esteem. Then that person will work towards gaining trust and information. So a lot of traffickers, again, this is a hidden crime. So even if I'm around traffickers, I might not know it. So if I'm a parent and I'm around someone, a trafficker, and I'm talking to this trafficker about, oh, yeah, my kid just seems so down lately and there's nothing that I can do, or I'm saying bad things about my kid to the extent that the trafficker is like, this person is not talking about their kid in a highly way. So maybe I can reach out to the kid. Like traffickers are looking to gather information as much as possible so then they can again use that to exploit the person. And it doesn't have to be directly from the individual they plan to exploit. It could be from a family member, a loved one, a friend. So traffickers are just always constantly gathering information so that they can figure out vulnerabilities and really prey on them. Then a trafficker will fill a need. So if someone is living in poverty, a trafficker can promise them a life with a lot more finances. If someone doesn't feel like they have any love in their life, they can provide them that love, whether it is romantic, friendly, or as a parental figure, mentor in their life. If someone is addicted to opioids, any kind of substance, and they can't afford it, a trafficker can promise to continue to finance that habit. And then after that need is fulfilled, that is when the trafficker will slowly begin to isolate. I say after that need is filled, more so it's while that need is being filled, the trafficker will start to put information into the victim's mind about, these other people don't support your new life. They don't want what's best for you. And they can just give them a lot of messages that essentially can cut off a victim's support system and continue to isolate them. Then, once that isolation occurs and someone doesn't have a support system, they feel like the trafficker is the only one that cares about them. And the trafficker will say something like, I have been buying you all these nice gifts and everything, and in order to maintain our lifestyle, I'm going to need you to do XYZ. And XYZ could be a commercial act. XYZ could be go to this hotel room and just wait for people to just come in over and over again and perform commercial sex with them all day and then give me that money. It could even look like, in order for me to really understand and trust that you want to be with me, I want you to give me your passport, your birth certificate, like all of your things so that I know that you're not going to leave me. And then that person just has no way out when they are feeling like they want to leave. And so after that abuse begins, a trafficker really just maintains control by then using oftentimes threats, still coercion. It can be subtle still, and just saying like nobody else wants you. And so they can maintain control easily because they've already gained trust and information. They've already made this person feel like we're in a loving relationship. They wouldn't treat me wrong. I just need to do this in order for my trafficker to get by because they love me. And so it's extremely, extremely manipulative, and it is why so many victims of human trafficking and sex trafficking have a hard time to identify that they are, because the trafficker, similar to domestic violence relationships, has basically manipulated them to thinking, to just cooperating in, I'm choosing this life versus this person is absolutely exploiting me for their benefit. It makes it hard for victims to be able to see unless someone is able to maybe point it out to them, or it is caught early by somebody else, or they're already aware of what trafficking signs are, which unfortunately for vulnerable populations doesn't happen often. Or by the time like someone is exposed to a presentation like this, they've already been through the ages where they're the most vulnerable. So now that we've talked about human trafficking, types of trafficking, what it can look like, how people are targeted, let's kind of end on a hopeful note and talk about how human trafficking can be stopped. It can be really overwhelming to learn about human trafficking because there are so many different forms. It can be so hidden that it feels like, where do I even begin? But everyone can absolutely play a role in ending human trafficking, even if it is by raising awareness through your own social media and just posting something that says, hey, it's Human Trafficking Awareness Month. These are some statistics, these are some resources, these are signs of human trafficking. All of those things can make a difference and really help. So in order to raise awareness about red flags for human trafficking, you yourself have to familiarize yourself with signs of what it looks like. And so my next slide, you'll see a lot of different resources that I looked into. Literally, if you just Google human trafficking, you'll run into major players in ending human trafficking. But once you're able to recognize the signs, it's a lot easier to start to tackle. If you suspect human trafficking, if you have any questions, if something just seems a little bit off to you, maybe you have a friend whose behaviors have dramatically changed, they have been more isolated, they're only hanging out with one person, and you are already nervous about that person having red flags that they were demonstrating, maybe it's worth talking about what is this person gaining from you? Are you being exploited? And then reporting it to the National Human Trafficking Hotline if you have those concerns. Of course, I am here. Our VSP is here to support you. So if you have any questions that you want to talk about, let us know. We're here. Again, we have access to emergency housing, confidential location. If you ever feel like there's no way out, we can definitely safety plan. So know that that's here. And then I think one of the biggest things is just be a conscientious and informed consumer. So there are resources like this responsible sourcing tool and the Department of Labor's list of goods produced by child labor or forced labor, which is a mouthful. There are resources that help you understand who is involved in creating the services or goods that you're providing. And again, with sex trafficking, make sure that there's transparency in the fact that a third party is compensating sex workers and that it's not sex trafficking, which means paying for porn if that's something that you are choosing to watch, and knowing where that profit is going. So I know there's so much that people have access to porn at their fingertips all of the time, in free porn. And so we have to acknowledge that in order to support sex workers and also make sure that sex trafficking has an end to it, we have to be looking into where's our money going and are we watching something for free, which is meaning that someone is being exploited somewhere. And it's kind of like that statement, I forget who said it, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. If you're getting your porn for free, someone's being exploited. If you are getting goods or services for free and not understanding where they're coming from or how someone has the money to purchase them or something like that, it's just important to kind of raise that red flag and wonder, look into, be curious about, and find out, okay, how is this happening? Because oftentimes it's going to be linked to someone being exploited. There's tons of podcasts out there, books out there that share people's stories of being trafficked. And so look into those so that you can get more familiar with the different forms of trafficking. So these are the resources that I used, and they're just a few of many. Again, if you Google human trafficking or sex trafficking, you'll get tons of information you can look into. And so this is my contact information. If you have any questions, if you want to talk more about something that I brought up during this presentation, but we didn't spend more time to address, definitely let me know. I am here to talk about any topics that y'all want to talk about. So if you have any ideas, absolutely let me know. And I just wanted to share that today is Wednesday. So tomorrow, Thursday, is Texas Sexual Assault Supporting Survivors Day. It's the second year that Texas is really recognizing a day to support and acknowledge survivors and survivors' voices. So I encourage everyone to wear teal tomorrow in honor of that. We will be having teal pins that we are tabling for and passing out. So if you're interested, definitely grab one. If you follow us on Instagram, then wear teal and tag us at UT Arlington RVSP. And then I cannot believe that next month is already February, but obviously next month is Black History Month. And in order to really celebrate that, acknowledge that, we will be doing a series called Black Women, Breaking the Silence in the Anti-Violence Movement. And that will be a presentation that's every Thursday at 2 p.m. to honor and celebrate a Black woman's contribution to the anti-violence movement. So the first presentation next Thursday, it will be about Rosa Parks before the bus and honoring her and how she and Recy Taylor worked together and how she went to Recy Taylor's defense. And y'all will be learning about Recy Taylor's story if you have not heard it. So that is what we will be talking about. So if y'all have any questions, need anything, please don't hesitate to let me know. I am here and I appreciate y'all taking the time to learn a little bit more about human trafficking today. So thank you.